So welcome. This is the 26th Annual Wilderness Issues Lecture Series, sponsored by the Wilderness Institute of the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. Thanks for coming. I'm Lori Young. I'm the Interim Director of the Wilderness Institute. The theme of this year's series is the future of wilderness in America, change, continuity, and conservation. And we've really chosen the 40th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, which just took place last September, to reflect back on 40 years of social and political and biological change, as well as think ahead to the kinds of challenges we're going to face in the future. And so there's a very diverse and dynamic set of speakers from both Missoula as well as across the country who are going to be joining us this spring to talk about a variety of different aspects of wilderness and how we might respond to future challenges related to wilderness and wilderness conservation. There are a number of very impressive local speakers as well as a number of national speakers. I only have time to call your attention to a few folks in addition to our speaker who's here tonight, Doug Scott. We have Bill Meadows, the president of the Wilderness Society, joining us, Mary Wagner, the first ever director of wilderness in the Forest Service, and M.A. Sanjan, lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy. So I hope you'll join us for future lectures as well. There are lecture series schedules just outside the door on a table if you don't have the whole schedule for the series. I'm just going to take a moment, since this is our first lecture, to thank a few individuals and organizations who really make this possible. And first of all, I want to thank two Wilderness Institute staff, Nikki Fear and Lori Ashley. Nikki co-coordinates the lecture series with me and helps organize all of these events, really makes things happen. Lori Ashley coordinates a number of different logistical and promotional events around the lecture series as well. I also want to thank NSF EPSCoR, who helped provide funding for Doug Scott to come and talk with us tonight. And I want to thank the Dana Gallery and Jeff Walker, who generously donated artwork to use for promotional purposes for the lecture series. This lecture series is available for credit. And if you are a student in this course and you did not attend the first course, which occurred 2 weeks ago, please see me after class for a syllabus and to discuss the requirements. Our speaker tonight, Doug Scott, will be talking for about 45 minutes, and after that we'll have a question and answer session until 8:30. And we're recording this both for radio broadcast as well as television broadcast. And so I'd like to ask, because this is a small room, the doors are loud, that you stay until 8:30 when the question and answer session will end promptly at 8:30. Doug will be doing a book signing outside after the lecture, and so at 8:30 he will move outside to the table where the books are going to be. And so if you'd like to buy a book, you'll find him there, and if you'd like to ask him a question, that's also where you'll find him. You won't find him up here at the podium. And so with that, we are very lucky to have Doug with us tonight to talk about wilderness policy history. I can't think of a better person to help us think about the past 40 years and the challenges that we'll face in the next 40 or 100 years or even 10 years. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Perry Brown, the Dean of the College of Forestry and Conservation and himself a leader in wilderness science and stewardship, who's going to introduce Doug tonight.
Thanks, Lori. You're going to hear from someone tonight who's one of America's most dedicated and passionate conservationists. And Doug's heard this little story, heard me tell this before, but I first met Doug about 35 years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. And my major professor caught me one day and said, "Hey, come on, I want you to come meet somebody." And so in the basement of Rackham Hall, I had an office. My major professor came down there, a fellow that a few people in the audience know, a guy named Ross Toscher. And he took me down to the very end of this basement hallway and introduced me to Doug Scott and a whole group of people who were in the process of putting together the first Earth Day in the United States. And they were involved in putting together the pieces to have a major teach-in on the University of Michigan campus and working very hard on this particular activity. And since that time, Doug has has done a lot of things that really brings his passion and his dedication to the conservation movement. Since his days at the University of Michigan, he served as a lobbyist for the Wilderness Society and as conservation director, and then as associate executive director of the Sierra Club. He currently serves as the policy director for the Campaign for America's Wilderness, which is an organization that is underwritten primarily by the Pew Charitable Trust to really provide some energy and some focus on wilderness issues and activities and policy in the United States. In 2004, Doug published this book, The Enduring Wilderness: Protecting Our Natural Heritage Through the Wilderness Act. And I recommend this to you as a great read for looking at the history, the meaning, the nuances, and things like that behind the act. Some of the things that you won't get by just sort of making a superficial view or taking a superficial view of what was going on and what was happening. Doug's put a lot of it together. Certainly he brings to life a lot of the significant players in that movement. And so I recommend, anyway, this to you. And so if you have a chance tonight or a little bit of money in your pocket and want to pick up one, you ought to do so. Well, with that, I'm not going to talk very long because you want to hear Doug, you don't want to hear me. So we want to have Doug Scott come forward, and we want to listen to him, look back a little bit, and look forward a little bit. Doug?
Thank you, Perry, and thank you, Lori and Nikki and your colleagues for inviting me here. And I'm going to try and remember not to wander away from this microphone, but Lori will throw things at me if I do. I think Perry's introduction should be a reminder to all of you who are in the halls of academia at this point in your lives to be nice to everybody you may meet or who gets dragged to say hello to you, because they may introduce you sometime 35 years later, and God knows what they might say. You know, wilderness is not a subject that needs an introduction, particularly to people in Missoula, Montana, but it is a topic of great interest. That great interest has only grown in the years since the Wilderness Act became law, just over 40 years ago. And it's a subject matter that wherever you are in the country, and there's wilderness campaigns and wilderness stewardship and wilderness issues playing out all across the United States in every kind of setting. But wherever wilderness is a topic, it is also a topic about which people have great strength of feelings, and including people on all sides. And I bring a particular perspective and commitment to the view of wilderness, but I want to be fair and make sure that the equally strong strength of feeling by someone who might not be on the same side of this issue as I am, and I make no bones about it. I am an advocate for a growing national wilderness preservation system. And so I want to begin tonight in the spirit of academic fair play to give what I think may be the definitive single one-paragraph statement of a completely alternate view of wilderness and the Wilderness Act. And my reading comes from the superintendent of the Richfield Public School District in Richfield, Idaho, testifying at the field hearing that the House of Representatives held on the Wilderness Act itself in 1962 in McCall, Idaho. And this man gets it all in a single paragraph. The proposed Wilderness Act is inimical to the welfare of the people of the state of Idaho and to its visitors. It is a confusing hodgepodge act that tries to be all things to all people. It is based on a false philosophy, is totally unnecessary, costly to taxpayers, and in violation of the laws of God and man. It is startling that such triviality and animus could be accorded credence by responsible citizens. But here we all are. And at least there is a debate that is accorded credence by a group of what I take to be self-selected responsible citizens. And so, having made that bow to fairness, that's the last I'll make this evening. I want to start first just with some myths of such ancient origins and depth of encrusted myth mythology that they have assumed sort of talismans in the controversies and debates about wilderness over many decades. First of all is the idea that the purpose of the wilderness preservation movement, those of us who are advocates for preserving wilderness and those who care about and support the preservation of wilderness, are in favor of some massive lockup, some massive taking away of the public lands from all other users for some effete enjoyment by some elite small group. And my response to that is, in the words of that well-established myth of the massive lockup, is taken from Senator Frank Church of the neighboring state of Idaho, one of the fathers of the Wilderness Act. And Senator Church said this about that: "We're spending a fortune building forest highways, developing campgrounds, marinas, and other recreational facilities. By the time we are done, 90% of our public lands will be accessible to the majority who want to take their vacation on wheels. But what about the people who don't? Are we to leave nothing for them? No escape from the pavement, the crowds, the billboards, the costly resorts? This country is big enough to leave some of its lands alone as a sanctuary for those who from time to time feel the need to get away from it all. Otherwise, we turn this country into a cage." And his figure was 90% being made available for all those manifold other uses. And I'm prepared to accept his ratio, and 10% sounds about right to me. And just to put that in perspective, if you leave out the very large proportion, over 50% of the total acreage of our National Wilderness Preservation System today, areas already protected by Congress as wilderness, which are in the state of Alaska. If you just look at the lower 49, 2.5% of all the land, not all the public land, of all the land in the lower 49 is now protected under the Wilderness Act. So to meet Senator Church's ratio, we still have a ways to go. Another part of that myth of that goes along with the massive lockup is that it's somehow for an elite, for some the young, the fit, the wealthy. And this one has ancient legs. We hear this echoes of this argument I've been hearing for decades and decades and decades. Again, Senator Church has something to say about this, but I have my own challenge. I've heard this at public hearings about wilderness over the years, and I always try and get up after someone says that and issue this little challenge, and no one has ever taken me up on it. Sir or madam, I know you feel strongly about your view that wilderness is just for the young and the fit and the wealthy. So you choose the wilderness area. You choose the day. You choose the trailhead. And I'll meet you there at dawn, and we'll stand there all day and census the people going in and out. And we'll see if it's just the fit and the hardy young and the wealthy. And everyone in this room, I think, who's ever stood, ever trod a trail in any of our wilderness areas will know that why I've never had a taker on that. Senator Church said it this way: "A few years ago, in the summer of 1973, I spent a week in the Sawtooth Wilderness. We were the only party with horses, but we encountered many other wilderness visitors, college students and mountain climbers in small groups, older backpackers and fishermen, and hardy parents and their kids. Not exactly the chic clientele you find in Sun Valley." I used that in Sun Valley the other day, and it didn't go over all that well. And a final one of these great myths about the imposition of this lockup of wilderness for the fit and elite is the hoary old argument that wilderness is being locked up for the rich and the effete by a cabal of eastern and, I guess you would say, blue state, west coast, bi-coastal effete, young, fit, rich Easterners. And I want to just denounce that as pure anti-historical, just flat wrong. The Wilderness Act, the law of this land, became the law of this land 40 years ago in September of 1964, only because of the leadership and the determined support of Westerners. The roll call of those who shaped the Wilderness Act. And yes, it was a conservative Republican from central Pennsylvania who was the lead sponsor in the House. And yes, it was a senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, who was the lead sponsor originally in the Senate. But in the Senate, the leadership got handed off to a series of folks as they were in the best position to help the legislation along. The second lead sponsor of the Wilderness Act in the Senate, and a crucial point in its history there, was Senator James Murray of the state of Montana, chairman of the committee, lead sponsor of the Wilderness Act. His role as the lead sponsor was then assumed by Senator Clinton Anderson, remembered as the father of the Wilderness Act because he was the lead sponsor and the chairman of the committee, a Democratic senator from New Mexico. The leading Republican acolyte advocate for the wilderness in the United States Senate from start to finish, a sponsor from day one, was the Republican minority whip of the Senate, the number 2 leader of the Republican Party in the Senate in that time, and a great champion for applying the Wilderness Act to additional lands in his own state, the great Senator Thomas Kuchel of California. Others, Frank Church, who I've mentioned, was the floor manager of the Wilderness Act when it passed the United States Senate, first in 1961 and again in 1963. It was always Westerners. It would not have been enacted had it not been Westerners. And it was always a process when those same Westerners started applying the Wilderness Act to additional lands, once it became law, to additional lands in their states. It has always been, and always will be, as I will expand on here a bit later, a process in which the choice of the lands and the decision to designate them for protection under the Wilderness Act is dominated by the delegation from the state affected. And there's reasons for that that I'll go into here in a moment. Now, there's another set of players that ought not to be forgotten when we look at the history of wilderness preservation, and one particularly good reason for not forgetting them is that they are the example of how wilderness will be preserved going forward, and that is the ordinary Americans who have taken the tool that the Wilderness Act is. After all, if you add it up, it's just 7 pages of type. Buried away, the original signed by President Johnson is moldering away in the deepest archives, deepest dungeons of the National Archives. It's just a piece of paper. Making it live by applying it to more and more real areas of land is the work of ordinary people who are fired by a passionate love of a particular piece of landscape that they've known and loved as wild, that they feel is threatened and whose wildness cannot otherwise be secured than by the guarantee of wilderness preservation using the statutory protection of the Wilderness Act. And these are hardware dealers like Cecil Garland, the hardware store owner in Lincoln, Montana, whose monument is the Great Scapegoat Wilderness, the campaign that he led in the late 60s and early 1970s to protect that area. I think of Nancy Hall, who may be at work this evening in her job, which is as a cocktail waitress in a casino in a small town in Nevada, and who had the satisfaction 3 years ago of knowing that President George W. Bush had just signed a law that designated a wilderness area, a 23,000-acre wilderness area, that she had been the citizen spark plug for moving forward politically to the point that it became an act of Congress. She had great satisfaction just 3 months ago when George Bush signed a law designating another area for addition to the wilderness system in eastern Nevada that was her particular baby. And so there's tons of stories about those kind of ordinary people whose passion for the land and its wildness, whose commitment that the best way to preserve it is statutory protection as wilderness, this little chunk of the federal lands, and whose commitment to practicing our democratic system takes them from their ordinary walk of life, often in many cases, to the halls of Congress and to the satisfaction of seeing that wilderness area preserved. This is a proud history, and it's a proud history put together by people who combined in an essential pattern every bit of the idealism that you could possibly imagine for the great ideal of wilderness, with a fundamental, practical, pragmatic approach to the realities of our political system. The two have gone hand in hand. And I'm not talking about just in more recent history. No finer example of that kind of mix of idealism and pragmatism exists than Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, Howard Zahniser, the father more than any one person of the Wilderness Act itself, and of scores of others of their colleagues who have, over the years, led this work from within the government agencies, from within the Congress of the United States and its staff, and from the citizenry, and including people on many sides of these debates. And that gets us down this mix of idealism about the ideal of wilderness and the practical pragmatics of, wait a minute, how do you get the statutory protection that only can be granted by act of Congress? That mix is reflected in the very philosophy that undergirds the Wilderness Act itself. The Wilderness Act was not the product of the federal agencies. The Wilderness Act was not, and most laws aren't, the original idea and product of the Congress of the United States. It was the product of the leadership of the National Wilderness Preservation Movement, and most particularly the leaders of the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club. The Wilderness Society, founded in 1935 by Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, and a series of other luminary, 8 luminary thinkers of that New Deal era, founded in reaction to the onslaught of accommodation of automobile tourism that was going on in the national parks, national forests, and other public lands across the country. And they founded the Wilderness Society, but they were people who lived double lives. Aldo Leopold had been a district ranger and a regional Forest Service official in the Southwest. Bob Marshall, to the end of his life, was the leading staff person in the chief's office in the Division of Recreation and Lands. He was the head of that division in the chief of the Forest Service's office in Washington, D.C. He had administrative responsibility for the wilderness work of the National Forest Service to the end of his life. So these were people who had a profound respect for and in many cases had their feet in the federal agencies. But they came to realize, having made a good faith attempt to use the processes of administrative protection. Beginning in 1924, when Aldo Leopold was the moving force in the establishment of the Gila Wilderness, the very first wilderness area, called that with a line drawn around it and a piece of official paper that said this is to be preserved for its wilderness values. 1924. And they made every good effort to make that kind of administrative protection for wilderness work. And the U.S. Forest Service was the pioneer in this, and they deserve enormous good credit. All kinds of nameless foresters and chiefs of the Forest Service, going back into the 20s, who nurtured this idea and who supported the designation of what became, by 1939, the year Bob Marshall died, the about 14 million acres of administratively protected documents created by administrative agencies, signed by some official of that agency, saying, we promise that this will remain, this area within this boundary will remain a wilderness area. But it turned out those promises were only as good as the piece of paper they were written on, and that piece of paper wasn't good enough. An administrative order of that kind that could be signed by one official one day could be altered by that official the next day, or abolished by a similar stroke of a pen by a subsequent official, let's say at a change of administration. It simply proved the practical experience of the wilderness movement, largely with the Forest Service and within the Forest Service, that these wilderness boundaries didn't stay put. They kept moving around, and particularly after World War II and the huge economic boom and the demand for timber that pushed logging up in and road building up into additional valleys, and the boom in tourism that meant more and more development in the national parks and the national forests and roads being pushed. There was no NEPA, there was no forest planning. It was just kind of a pervasive pattern spreading with appalling speed across every valley, up every valley, across every plateau across the United States and our public lands. And Before his death, Bob Marshall used the wonderful metaphor of the wilderness was disappearing before their eyes, like some snowbank in June on a south-facing slope on a hot afternoon in June, just melting away. And the cause of the wilderness leadership was how to make the lines stay put. And if you want to know why we have a Wilderness Act, and celebrated its 40th anniversary just last September, that is it in a nutshell. It is to make the lines stay put. And it turns out that, for reasons I will elaborate on here, a line that is embraced in a statutory law passed by Congress is a lot harder to change. It's not that it can't be changed, and wilderness lines have been changed once Congress designated them. It's happened before, it will happen again. But the process of that change is different. And so the function of the Wilderness Act was not some big reform of how the Forest Service had been administering wilderness areas. There was essentially no reform of how the Forest Service had been managing wilderness. The Congress and these Western senators and congressmen that dominated the shaping of the act honored the kind of management those areas were receiving on September 2nd, 1964, and meant to perpetuate it on September 3rd when the Wilderness Act became law. What they were after was not reform of management and stewardship of wilderness and use of wilderness so much as it was the degree of security that the wilderness lines, once decided upon by our society, that the presumption would be those lines would stay put as they had not under purely administrative protection. And this was based on a conclusion that was enunciated, again, back in 1939. The Wilderness Act took a long time to be invented and to gestate and to come to a boil before Congress ever began to consider it and pass it. 1939, the head of the Isaac Walton League of America, writing in their magazine, and he was writing about both the wild parts of the national parks, the backcountry of the national parks, and these national forest administrative wilderness areas. He says, there's no assurance that any one of them or all of them might not be abolished as they were created by administrative decree. They exist by sufferance and administrative policy, not by law. And so, with the enactment of the Wilderness Act, perhaps the most important accomplishment was that as additional areas are designated as wilderness by a law passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the President of the United States, that law includes by reference a particular map. And that map includes a particular boundary. And that boundary is a part of the law. And that boundary cannot be changed except by the enactment of another law. Well, now, here's Civics 101 for you from a practitioner of the hard business of legislative politics. It is very hard. It is very hard to pass a law through Congress. Any law, a resolution in favor of motherhood, a resolution opposed to motherhood, a resolution declaring, the turkey the national bird. It doesn't matter what it is. Legislation is inherently hard to pass, and that isn't just the way it happened to be. The legislative process was deliberately designed. By who? By the founders of our democracy, who had just been doing what? Risking life and limb at a price of enormous treasure and blood to throw off the tyranny of a king and a parliament. They were not interested in suddenly making an interest easier for another group of people, even themselves, to pass laws. And so they designed a legislative process which requires the House to pass a bill, but also the Senate. And the bills have to be word for word and comma for comma identical, or they die. If they are word for word and comma for comma identical, then they go to the White House and the president may or may not sign them. That's a long obstacle course. I liken the legislative process to a high hurdle race. To win, you have to get all the way around the track first and you can't knock over any of the hurdles in your lane. For your opponent to lose, all you have to do is hire somebody to sneak out when they're not looking and knock over one of the hurdles. And there are a whole bunch of hurdles, and they're all very tippy. And so the process of killing legislation is inherently easier. This is a sweeping generalization, but inherently easier. Out of the thousands of bills that are introduced in our Congress every 2 years, a relative handful, a few hundred, become law in any given year. And that's a fact of life that the people who decided to put the wilderness designation decision in Congress and take it out of the hands of the administrative agencies where it used to be and where it wasn't working for that permanent security, that was a conscious choice. And were they making a conscious choice to take wilderness decisions out of the hands of the professionals and turn them over to the, God help us, the politicians? Well, don't delude yourself. There is nothing inherently more political about the legislative processes practiced by members of Congress than about the politics of the administrative process practiced in the executive branch of the government. One major difference, and certainly the major difference at the time the Wilderness Act was being conceived and passed, was that the politics of decisions made in the administrative agencies was that they were made in the dark behind closed doors. And the public learned about them only when it was too late. And that was true of a whole sequence of decisions in that era before the Wilderness Act, by which the administration and the political leadership of the Forest Service removed lands from the designated wilderness that Bob Marshall and Aldo Leopold had worked so hard to preserve at an earlier time. Now, this fact of life about the legislative inertia that says it's hard to pass laws, very hard, means that those of us who work to see additional wilderness areas, let's just, for example, think of the Rocky Mountain Front, or the Great Burn, or the Winton-Wedemeyer country, or the great forests of the Yak, that places like those will be added to the wilderness system only if we, under the leadership of the people of Montana, can work out the process to getting around that high hurdle race without knocking over any of the hurdles. And that is a burden that makes it very hard to expand the wilderness system, but not so hard as it's impossible. And I celebrate the fact that it's hard, because it is the fact that it's hard that is the principal reason we can have any great hope that we are in fact preserving wilderness areas once we draw a line around them, and we do pass such a law in perpetuity, forever, for our children's children's grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren and the grandchildren of the grizzlies as well, and the wild salmon. That guarantee of perpetuity is because the minute it becomes a line in statute around that wilderness area, then the burden shifts. And altering that line, which does happen, altering that line also takes an act of Congress. And the burden of proof is then on those who would change it. 7 years into the debate in the Congress, 7 years after the Wilderness Act was first introduced in 1956, its principal draftsman, Howard Zahniser, the executive director of the Wilderness Society, just a month before his death, gave a speech in Portland at a wilderness conference in the spring of 1974, and he reflected in a very philosophical way about lessons he'd learned about how our democratic government works, democratic with a small d. And he said, one of the lessons I've learned to emphasize about our government is this: it is very difficult for anybody in our form of government to get anything done that anybody else doesn't want done. Now, and this is a man who'd been frustrated in seeing his Wilderness Act blocked for 7 years. Now you can see right away that's a pretty good characteristic of a large democratic government established by a people who have learned to fear tyranny and to fear over-government. And I subscribe to that Zahniser belief in the importance of the statutoriness of the security that comes for wilderness boundaries when only Congress may designate them. And one example of the kind of power of this law, to put this in perspective for you, today there are just 2,000 acres shy of 106,500,000 acres in the wilderness, in the National Wilderness Preservation System. In October of 2003, the boundary of an already existing Forest Service wilderness area in northern Utah, the Mount Naomi Wilderness, was altered. Took an act of Congress. It was agreed upon by everybody concerned, the local environmental groups, the congressional delegation, the agency, the Forest Service, and it's the powers that be. The President of the United States signed the bill, and the boundary was altered to correct an error, an admitted error, everybody agreed, in the boundary of the Mount Naomi Wilderness. Took an act of Congress passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the President of the United States, George W. Bush, to correct that boundary error, which involved 31 acres. That's the power of the Wilderness Act, that it took that degree of process to alter a wilderness boundary by 31 acres. It's that power that makes the long and difficult battle to preserve wilderness areas worth the effort. Well, this brings me to a theme of the night, which I've already touched on briefly, and that is the age-old tension between idealism and practicality, idealism and pragmatism in political decisions of any kind that you can think about. We're the pioneers of the wilderness idea, these legendary names, Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, John Muir, Howard Zahniser, and so many more. Were these great idealists of wilderness? Of course they were, fired by a deep visions of the essential place, not a luxury, an essential need for our culture to preserve areas of real wilderness. But these supreme wilderness idealists were also supreme wilderness pragmatists. They were careful students of the realities of the legislative process and of the politics of the legislative process. They knew that nothing they could draft or enact in the Wilderness Act was going to alter the fundamental characteristics by which bodies of legislators reach their decisions. There are immutable realities. They're not embraced in the rule books that you can get of the rules of how the House or the Senate operate. They are the realities of how groups of very different people representing constituencies reflecting the entire breadth of a huge continental nation manage to work things out to the point that they can pass anything. And there are four fundamental characters that emerge from looking at the history of wilderness backwards that tell us something about the history yet to be written about the continued growth of the wilderness system that I would like to dwell on for just a few minutes each this evening. Four fundamental characteristics of the wilderness process, of the legislative process, that are fundamentally engaged in the process of decisions Congress makes to extend protection of the Wilderness Act to additional lands. And the first, pretty simple-minded. The politics of enacting legislation to designate wilderness work best where there is bipartisan support, and that has always been true. The original Wilderness Act, introduced in the, and I have a copy that I'll wave around here at some point, I didn't remember to bring it up with me, of the very original Wilderness Bill, introduced in June 7th of 1956 in the United States Senator by Senator Hubert Humphrey, had 9 sponsors, 9 co-sponsors. Of those 10, himself and the 9 co-sponsors, 4 were Republicans, most were Westerners, and even those that were from the East, in most cases, had wilderness in their own states. And there's designated wilderness in the states of every single one of them today, because there's now designated wilderness under this law in 44 of the 50 states. It was bipartisan from the outset. And while it's a little hard to have a bipartisan wilderness package in, let's say, just pick one, the state of Idaho these days, given that the entire delegation is Republican, nonetheless, the same concept holds, that the progress of wilderness protection, had the enactment of the Wilderness Act itself and the progress of wilderness protection going through all these 4 decades and looking ahead, works best when it's bipartisan. We expect action in the U.S. Senate shortly on a couple of things that held over from the last Congress. They are bipartisan wilderness bills in states like California, and even sooner than that, action coming in for a small Bureau of Land Management area in New Mexico. Bipartisan from the outset. The second fundamental reality and characteristic of the legislative process that bears on all of this is that Congress does not pass sweeping visions. It acts within the art of the possible. It acts incrementally. And as much as we, and especially those of us with an academic turn of mind, might like to imagine the perfect wilderness system, and I'll talk about this again in just a moment, but Congress doesn't enact the perfect. It enacts the possible. And those aren't ever, best I can remember, the same thing. You may remember the Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton sweeping visionary plan that would have extended health care to essentially everyone in our society, certainly far more than enjoy any kind of assurance of health care at a reasonable cost today. What you will remember primarily about is it sank of its own weight. Yes, it was visionary, but it sure was not art of the possible. And rapidly enough, that became clear to all involved. And so, just as the Congress did not decide what the vision of an ideal national park system would be and create it willy-nilly in 1872 ahead of the onrush of Western development, they at least got their foot in the door and established the rather visionary idea of Yellowstone at 2 million acres, which in 1872 was an astonishing enough achievement. And then they found out they liked the idea, and the American people liked the idea, and they added places, and people said, hey, there's a place in our state that is an outstandingly superb part of the ecosystem and wonders of the American continent. And so slowly but surely, Congress has built the national park system that we all take such pride in today, and it continues to build that system a bit each year. And that is true of the wilderness system as well. It has taken more than 120 separate acts of Congress enacted in the 4 decades since the Wilderness Act itself designated just the first 9 million acres. Remember I said the system today is almost 106,500,000 acres? Well, it started life in 1964, the day the ink was dry on the Wilderness Act, at 9.1 million acres. And so all that additional, almost 98 million acres, has been added in incremental steps over the ensuing 4 decades, and that will continue to be the case. And so the second point I draw out is that Congress makes these decisions incrementally, and it is unreasonable to expect them to do otherwise because it is not in the character of the way they are capable of making decisions. And that's not a judgment about them, that's just the way it is. The third fundamental characteristic about the legislative process that we can emphasize in discussing the wilderness issue is that where issues involving disposition and competing uses of our public lands are involved, the politics of how Congress chooses to work these informal, unwritten rules gives by far the overwhelming say on the decision to the members of the congressional delegation of the state involved. A wilderness decision made in 2005 or 2006 in the state of Montana will be made by those 3 people who represent the state of Montana in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, and whose names we know, not by anybody else. And that's the way it will be. Now, you think about it, that doesn't seem like such a terribly bad idea if you take it sort of out of the context, however deeply committed you are to the idea that maybe for wilderness it ought to be done some other way. But imagine yourself as the New Jersey congressional delegation. You would not take kindly the meddling on a decision primarily involving your state and primarily affecting the citizens of your state, however momentous the national implications might be to interested partisans. You would take unkindly to the Montana delegation trying to dominate that decision. And by exactly the same token, it's not unreasonable for Conrad Burns and Denny Rehberg and Max Baucus to feel that they ought to be deferred to, just as the New Jersey delegation expects them to defer to the New Jersey delegation on matters involving wilderness in New Jersey. There is designated wilderness in New Jersey, 26 miles from Times Square, one of my favorite wilderness areas, incidentally. So simply put, the Montana congressional delegation and the politics of wilderness in Montana are the politics that will decide the future of proposed wilderness areas in this state, and that has always been the case. And because I was intimately involved as the lobbying coordinator for the great campaign in the late 70s that resulted in the passage of the historic Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, the largest land conservation act in the history of this or any other nation, I'm constantly having people throw that one at me. Well, you overrode Ted Stevens and others in the Alaska Congressional Delegation of the Alaska Lands Act, and the simple answer is, no, we didn't. We gave it a good college try. We had a lot of things going for us. We had the President of the United States on our side. That helps. We had the leadership of the United States House of Representatives on our side. That sure helps. But the realities of the legislative process and its politics ultimately came to bear. And the Alaska Lands Act that actually became law, not what we started with, but what we ended with, exacted enormous concessions to the congressional delegation of the state of Alaska. We had them over the barrel in the House of Representatives, and so the House of Representatives twice, in 1978 and again in 1979, enacted a version of the Alaska Lands Act that simply put the Arctic coastal plain and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the wilderness system right then and there. And the President of the United States was for that. We won a vote on that exact question on the House floor on a day when members of Congress had to stop in gas lines on their way to work. But we could not sustain it in the final going of the bill that was enacted into law a couple of years later, and that's why there's even continues to be the great battle over the Arctic coastal plain, the drilling that's going on today. Now, so the third characteristic is that the state congressional delegation has the overriding influence on the outcome and the particulars of legislation designating wilderness in any given state, and that too was a reality understood and consciously chosen by those who authored the Wilderness Act and made the fateful choice, and I believe the right choice, to move these decisions out of the black box politics of the executive branch into at least getting that level of higher security from statutory protection. And I don't want to be overly partisan this evening, but let me just try and ask you to imagine if we had 106.5 million acres in the wilderness system today, and it was within the administrative authority of the executive branch of the United States and the people in power over that branch today to change any of those boundaries on their own say-so, how happy would we be? I rest my case. The fourth essential fundamental characteristic of the legislative process that comes out of this history and tells us about the history yet to be written is that the essential lubricant which allows any law on any subject to be enacted by the incredibly diverse elected representatives we send to Congress from across this country, the essential lubrication is a compound of accommodation and compromise. Well, now I've done it. I've used just unacceptably dirty words, and the FCC will be after me, no doubt. Compromise, accommodation. Oh, horrors. Any great vision of social progress falls into a pit of doom at the mercy of compromise and accommodation. But let's leave all of our armaments at the door for a minute and say, what else would we expect in a huge, diverse, and pluralistic democratic small d society? How else are we to make decisions than to have some mechanism by which those who make our governing laws lubricate their decisions by a degree of accommodation so they can ever get 50% plus one of the votes it takes to accomplish anything? Again, I think it is not inconsistent with the idealism of wilderness preservation to understand that it is accomplished by processes which do not depend on the ideal but on the pragmatics of this kind of democratic decision-making in the pragmatic realities of the legislative process. And this need for accommodation and a compromise was something that our idealistic founders of the wilderness concept clearly understood and embraced. And it arises from a very simple reality. It was a reality when they were doing their work in the 20s and 30s. I'm talking about Leopold and Marshall, every bit as much as it is a reality today. And that is that we are applying wilderness designation to lands on which other uses have already, in many cases, become established and practiced. Aldo Leopold wrote about this in one of his earliest wilderness articles in 1925 in American Forests magazine. He said, an incredible number of complications and obstacles arise from the fact that the wilderness idea was born after rather than before the normal course of commercial development had begun. The existence of these complications is nobody's fault, but it will be everybody's fault if it does not serve as a warning against delaying immediate inauguration of a comprehensive system of wilderness areas. In his 1930 classic, one of the foundational documents of the wilderness movement, The Problem of the Wilderness, published in 1930 by Bob Marshall in a precursor of Scientific American, he said in words of such stunning practicality that they would seem radical in some circles today, radically heretical, I should say. I'm quoting Bob Marshall, certain infringements on the concept of an unsullied wilderness will be unavoidable in almost all instances. And he said, a way out of these obstacles and complexities can often be found, and these, quoting Bob Marshall, almost all the disadvantages can be minimized by forethought and some compromise. So you see, I'm in pretty good company using that word. Howard Zahniser, no slouch when it came to idealism for wilderness, wrote this in 1949. Where considerations of expediency or recognition of existing practices have permitted inconsistent wilderness uses, for example, such as domestic stock grazing within designated wilderness areas, such uses should be recognized as non-conforming and looked upon as subject to termination as soon as that can be done, and done equitably for those immediately concerned. Such non-conforming uses should be permitted only where their temporary sufferance appears to be a means of ensuring future values of the area. And that is the analysis that we find ourselves, the dilemma that we find ourselves caught on in many of these legislative debates. But consider his words, where considerations of expediency, you could get drummed out of some meetings for using dirty language such as that. The point I really want to make, and this is leading up to a broader point, especially if I can find my piece of paper, is that this sense of pragmatism to adjust the idealism of wilderness to the real world in which these decisions have to be made has some important aspects that come out of the history of wilderness. Here's one. Those who wrote the Wilderness Act did not embrace a vision of pure wilderness. The purity doctrine about wilderness has nothing to do with the legislative intent of those who drafted or those who enacted the Wilderness Act. It is a simple reality that those folks accepted and understood and talked about at the time, that man has already had some degree of impact on every acre of our landscape. And so they were more practical in their concept. They took their marching orders from Aldo Leopold, who in one of the essays in the back of the San County Almanac says, in any practical program of wilderness preservation, the unit areas to be preserved must vary greatly in size and degree of wildness. Sitting down here not so many miles south of where we are this evening, at the 1960 Governing Board meeting of the Wilderness Society, which was held in Shoup, Idaho, on the Salmon River. One of the other great leaders of the Wilderness Society, Sigurd Olson, said this, as recorded in the minutes of that meeting: "We will have to accept certain things in the wilderness, or we'll end up with a definition and no wilderness." And how did the Wilderness Act, how did the members of Congress deal with this set of issues? Well, Clinton Anderson, the father of the Wilderness Act in the Senate, took the trouble to carefully explain the rationale section by section for the wording of the Wilderness Act at the outset of the final round of the legislative process. And he looked at the definition of wilderness in Section 2C of the Wilderness Act, and he said, this contains two definitions. The first is a definition of pure wilderness areas, areas where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. It states the ideal, said Senator Anderson. The second sentence, added to the law by your own Senator James Murray in 1960, the second of two sentences in the definition, defines the meaning or nature of an area's wilderness as used in the proposed act. A substantial area retaining its primeval character without permanent improvements, which is to be protected and managed so that the impact of man's works are substantially unnoticeable. And in his words, Senator Anderson said, the second of these definitions of the terms gives the meaning used in the act, which is somewhat less severe or pure than the first. And now let's take some testimony from the people who passed the Wilderness Act on this score. The great sainted Lee Metcalf in 1977. A favorite ploy of the anti-wilderness, pro-exploitation officials of the Nixon administration is to define wilderness so strictly that few areas could qualify. I urge all Montanans to read the Wilderness Act and understand its provisions. Frank Church, in a speech that same year in Idaho, spoke of an article written by the great outdoorsman, sportsman Ted Trueblood, in which he accused the Forest Service in its purest document of that era of trying to scuttle the Wilderness Act. Ted referred to requirements which make outfitter operations difficult, to fish and wildlife management activities which limit the enjoyment of hunters and fishermen, to the exclusion of deserving Idaho areas from wilderness classification because they contain some minor evidence of man's prior activities, and perhaps most tragic of all, the burning of historic cabins to eliminate the evidence of earlier human habitation. Senator Church, the floor manager of the Wilderness Act, said such policies are misguided. If Congress had intended that wilderness be administered in so stringent a manner, they would have never written the law as we did. It is not the intent of Congress that wilderness be administered in so pure a fashion as to needlessly restrict its customary public use and enjoyment and leave it to an hard-bitten, I gather from having him described to me, Montana outfitter up in what's now the Scapegoat Wilderness named Buff Hultman, who wrote a letter to us at the Wilderness Society in the late 60s warning of what the Forest Service was up to in the height of its purest dogma. And he said the agency was allowing trails, bridges, and campsites to fall into disrepair in the wilderness area in observance of its purest policies, even as it was touting backcountry protection for other areas as best suited for outdoor recreation. And in what I take to be a definitive bit of good colloquial Montana speech, Buff Hultman said, "This is a bunch of tripe." Was then, is now. The Wilderness Act was written by pragmatists who fired their idealism with an actual intent to get something accomplished. And it was written by Westerners. And they didn't theorize about what they meant by wilderness. Every one of those Westerners that I have mentioned to you, and Senator Humphrey in Minnesota, had existing Forest Service wilderness areas which had been in existence for decades in their own states. When he thought about what the Wilderness Act was trying to accomplish to bring greater security to places of wilderness in his state, Lee Metcalf thought about the Bob. Frank Church thought about the great Idaho primitive area. Aldo Leopold thought about Clinton Anderson thought about the Gila wilderness that he knew intensely well and loved deeply. They weren't out to invent an ideal concept. They were out to invent and to apply a practical process. And just one example, there's a lot of assumptions about the compromises embraced in the Wilderness Act and how somehow or other they were wrung out of the unwilling environmental leaders of that era by the long 8-year debate over the Wilderness Act. Well, the 8-year debate over the Wilderness Act was about something else. Take three of the so-called compromises in the Wilderness Act. Established grazing, previously established, is allowed to continue. The established use of motorboats, where previously established prior to the time and areas designated as wilderness, may be allowed to continue. The landing of aircraft, where previously established, as in the airstrips in the Bob and the Selway, may be continued. And all three of those compromises were in Howard Zahniser's very first handwritten draft of the Wilderness Act, drafted February 8th, 1956. However many years ago that was tonight, sitting at his dining room table in Hyattsville, Maryland. They were accommodations made by supremely pragmatic idealists. Congressman Saylor, great friend of mine who was the father of the Wilderness Act in the House of Representatives, conservative Republican, went out of his way as to say that the purpose of the Wilderness Act was not reform on how the Forest Service was administering such areas at the time, with these kind of exceptions that are so much subject of debate today, but was to give sanction to and continue the present regulations. Senator Humphrey talked about the purpose of this legislation is not reform, but security. The Secretary of Agriculture, Orville Freeman, one of the two chief lobbyists for the Wilderness Act for President Kennedy and then President Johnson, said that there are within these areas trails and facilities of a primitive nature for camping, including primitive sanitary facilities. These would continue under our present policy and could continue under the bill. And so, supreme idealism married with the practical realities of the legislative process to gain a level of statutory security which is not perfect, not immutable, not beyond being altered, but stronger than any other form of protection that anyone has found for public areas of our public lands. Well, I will draw to a close here with an observation about the future scale of the wilderness system. And this will echo something I said at the outset. How big should the National Wilderness Preservation System become? What are the dimensions of an ideal wilderness system? How much wilderness will be enough? These questions, and I'm reading from the book, these questions have no answers and can have none. The decisions to be made in the future lie in the future and cannot be constrained. Congress today can't pass a law that binds Congress in the future from choosing to add more lands to the wilderness system. One could hypothecate an ideal wilderness system, but such hypothecations would amount to little more than the projections of the rapidly outdated assumptions and biases of whoever happened to make the hypothecations. A group of conservation biologists might describe one ideal wilderness system, a group of equally eminent zoologists another, and a convention of poets yet another altogether. My money's on the poets. Hikers would have one vision, theologians another. The ideal wilderness system to the Blue Ribbon Coalition would not look like the ideal at all to the board of directors of the Sierra Club. One lover of alpine meadows might conclude that we've preserved more than enough kitty litter wilderness in the Mojave Desert, but not enough of his favorite terrain. While a devotee of vast Arctic wilderness areas might see little point in the designation of the Great Swamp Wilderness in suburban New Jersey, 3,700 acres of fabulous wilderness, 26 miles from Times Square. And what would be the point of such an exercise? Congress doesn't pass legislation based on this kind of ideal analysis. If it did, things in our society might be either a great deal better or a great deal worse. Congress muddles through, and it always has been thus. Recently, as I was writing this book last spring, a group of third-generation ranchers from the Rocky Mountain front country traveled from Choteau to Washington, D.C. to urge protection of the National Forest wildlands below the rim of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, area greatly threatened by oil and gas and other development. And they met with Senator Conrad Burns, and a reporter happened to tag along, a reporter for the Lee papers, including the Missoulian, and reported that the senator in the meeting seemed unmoved by the advocacy of these four ranchers. And afterwards, I'm told by one of the ranchers that the reporter was out in the hall essentially trying to egg them to say something provocative about the lack of response that they got at that particular meeting from Senator Burns. And one of the ranchers, third-generation rancher Carl Rappold, told the reporter he'd felt neither that they'd been bamboozled nor that he had wasted his time. He said, just because he's on one side of the fence and we are on the other doesn't mean we can't both of us look for the gate. A rancher, not a silver-tongued Washington lobbyist, gave you the very basics of the politics of wilderness. In the book, I say a rancher, not a hard-bitten lobbyist or politician, put his finger on the key to successful wilderness preservation. Choosing up sides and having pitched battles sometimes may be the only choice, but inevitably it always comes down to working things out in some degree of accommodation, or nothing gets done. This is the lesson about how the National Wilderness System has been built over 4 decades. And this is where more remains to be done. And in this work, everyday Americans like Carl Rappold and like you bring what is most important, your commitment to the heroic ideal of our participatory democracy. Yes, it's important to care passionately about the wilderness, but I think it's every bit as important to care passionately that our democracy works. And it works only when citizens roll up their sleeves and participate. The great German sociologist Max Weber wrote that politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards. The strong and slow boring of hard boards. But if you're going to get it done, you got to keep at it. The great historian of the American closing of the American frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, reminded us that our founding fathers and the early pioneers were probably unaware of the fact that their most fundamental traits, their institutions, even their ideals, were shaped by the interaction between the wilderness and themselves. American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried on the Sarah Constance to Virginia or on the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. With the enactment of the Wilderness Act, Aldo Leopold's idea that wilderness is a fundamental instrument for building citizens. Now, that's not the way we usually think about it. A fundamental instrument for building citizens. This concept of democracy gaining new strength at the frontier is true at the frontier of today's wilderness movement. It's true when Carl Rappold can have a perfectly civil discussion with Senator Burns, and when they can follow that up and try and get closer and closer to some degree of mutual understanding. Passion, boldness, idealism, you bet. A commitment to understanding and participation in our democracy, fueled by not only by the ideal of wilderness, but by the ideal and love of our participatory democracy itself. These are among the qualities required of those who aspire to save wilderness. And at bottom, I think, and I'll end with the words of my great friend Terry Tempest Williams, because she has captured this idea in more brilliant imagery than I could ever aspire to, and it's how I end my book. And I promote this book shamelessly because all the proceeds go back to support the grassroots work of groups like the Montana Wilderness Association. She talks about what I consider the ultimate rationale for the protection of a great generous sample of our wilderness on our public lands. And that is that we owe nothing less to future generations. Because if we make all the choices in our time, we'll leave them no choices to make in theirs. And here's how Terry creates that image. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with clasped hands that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. To protect what is wild is to protect what is gentle. Perhaps the wilderness we fear is the pause between our own heartbeats, the pause that reminds us that we live by grace alone. Wilderness lives by that same grace. It is within our legislative power to create merciful laws. Wild mercy is in our hands. Thank you so much. I have gone on longer than I should, and I am going to repeat any questions that are asked, and I apologize for straying a little beyond the time.
Becoming useless because of compromise and because of the pragmatic viewpoint you're talking about, that they've lost that idealism that drove them. How do you respond to that criticism?
Yeah, there's a lot been in the press, including the front page article in the New York Times yesterday about the death of environmentalism. I took that with a very powerful grain of salt when I read about it. It wasn't in the obituary column, but it sure read like it. Because in December I found myself attending the annual meeting, as I have at some times over the years, of the Montana Wilderness Association up in Helena. A meeting where the governor-elect spoke to the group, the incoming president of the state senate spoke to the group, people who weren't expecting to have those offices except for the results of the very recent election. And I spoke I listened carefully and heard that the membership in the Montana Wilderness Association has more than doubled in 3 years, that its finances, its resources, its membership are all at an all-time high. And I don't think the people who wrote the obituary of the environmental movement ever attended a meeting of the Montana Wilderness Association. I also know something that happened in your legislature today. Office by office, some people made some visits to members of your legislature to talk today about snowmobile controversies on public lands in Montana. And it was a team of 2 people from the Montana Wilderness Association and the Snowmobile Association, talking about the good, pragmatic agreements that are being worked out county by county and area by area for reasonable accommodation of competing uses of a public resource. And I'm sorry, I refuse to let sweeping generalizations about the death of the environmental movement, the demise of its political impact, get me very worked up at all, because I travel this country and I hang out with people, and I can't talk about clean air groups. I don't hang out with that many of those, or about population control groups, or about recycling groups, but I do hang out with wilderness and public land groups. And it's not what I see. And it's not what I see in the state after state after state where serious progress is being made in serious conversations about the designation and protection of additional wilderness areas with Republican and Democratic congressmen. And yes, this day and age, it's not as easy as some remember it used to be in the old days. I don't remember that it was ever all that easy. And I don't remember that these things were ever clean and simple. But I think that sweeping generalizations are really unhelpful. My belief is that there'll be very substantial additions to the wilderness system. George Bush has designated in laws that he signed, George W. Bush, half the amount of land that his father designated during his one term, and he's still got 4 more years to go. And that continues a long, bipartisan tradition of every president who has served since Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act has helped expand the wilderness system. On George Bush's watch, a conservative not sent to office to preside over the huge expansion of the wilderness system, I would guess, the U.S. Forest Service, in decisions, every one of which are cleared administratively all the way up to political appointees of his at the Department of Agriculture, has recommended the designation through forest planning of an additional about 3 million acres so far, and that process is just getting underway. Most of those decisions have not yet come. I don't think any of those decisions have come yet in Montana and in a lot of other states. But in Colorado, in South Dakota, in Alaska, and a number of other places, the U.S. Forest Service in the Bush administration is recommending additional wilderness areas. Don't ask me about the Interior Department. Yes, ma'am.
How do more extreme groups and activists affect your work with Congress?
How do more extreme groups and activists affect my work with Congress? Well, I believe everyone has the right to their opinion and the right to voice their advocacy. And so I'm not upset by the fact that there are a lot of people who disagree or take a different course or believe in a different approach than the approach that I happen to believe. I practice in a field in which I've been working for many years, and I think I have a pretty good grasp of what works, and I counsel people, that's my role these days, who are trying to work in the process in that pragmatic kind of a way. We shall see. These things are not without controversy. They've never been out without controversy, including within our movement. And our movement, the wilderness preservation movement, is kind of an interesting beast. There is no entrance exam. There is no board of examiners. And you can be one if you say you are one. And so, it is a very broad, very inclusive group of people with very different backgrounds who come from very different experiences. There are people out there, good number of them, whose what I said this evening about Congress not passing visionary things is just absolutely contradictory to what they're trying to accomplish. Swell. I wish them luck. If Congress would pass a vision of the wilderness system and happen to manage my vision, I guess I'd be pretty pleased. It isn't the Congress I know. And my observation is I think I know a fair amount about how this Congress operates through many different kind of regimes over and going on 40 years now. And that doesn't say that I'm right. That just says that I know what I know. And so I expect my experience and my views to be given the same degree of respect that I would accord to the views of other people who I think are wrong. But that doesn't, I'm not going to disagree with their advocacy. I don't spend my time trying to undercut the advocacy of other people, even if I disagree rather strongly with it. And on those occasions, as some in this room know, where I've been a little overly critical out of school and named any names, I've lived to regret it, and I've been properly called on it, and I try not to do it anymore. And I'm sorry, I'm not repeating the questions very effectively for our friends in greater radio land, on XM radio or whoever this is. George.
I want to sort of challenge you on a couple of points that you made. Not so much on the issue of compromise or whether people should compromise, because I think we all know that every day in our lives we make compromises. The issue comes down to how many compromises, what compromises, when do you go too far. But let's go back to the whole idea of wilderness and the Wilderness Act. And the statement that you made about the Wilderness Act wasn't really an effort to change management. It was really an effort to solidify the boundaries so they wouldn't be changed. I've read a lot of Sonnheiser's writings and other writings, as I know you have as well. Humphrey made the point when he introduced the bill that these areas will be managed basically the way they have been, except that the agencies will now have the additional charge of preserving the wilderness character. And Sonnheiser made that point many times too, that that's really what made wilderness different than primitive areas, which were pretty much set aside in the wilderness and wild areas the Forest Service set aside, which really was to stop that onslaught of road building and logging and all those things. It was to preserve certain conditions on the land, but it went further in the Wilderness Act to preserve wilderness character. Sonnheiser then also said about compromise that one of the greatest threats that he saw long-term for the wilderness system was compromises designed to bring, essentially to bring more people into the support for wilderness, when maybe what those people wanted was something other than wilderness, less than wilderness. He says, in that we see one of the greatest threats. Given that, do you see that there is some risk in many of the compromises we're making to the integrity of the wilderness system that was envisioned 40 years ago, and that we might be losing sight of that a little bit today?
The question is not easily summarized, but it comes down to a bit of a challenge that in fact, compromises can be made which accommodate more people and accommodate, I would extend, a non-conforming uses in the politics of the moment, and are we going too far? I don't know if that reasonably fairly gets us in the ambit. And the questioner is a friend of mine, and we've contested about some of these ideas in what I hope has been a friendly and respectful way for years, and will continue to do so. These are judgments. And honest people can feel very strongly about different versions of the outcome of what they judge to be involved. None of this effort to accomplish protection for additional lands comes without risk. You don't get into the legislative process. If you're satisfied that 106,498,000 acres is just about the perfect wilderness system today, then you've solved your problem, because you don't get into the risks inherent in attempting to extend that same degree of statutory protection to additional landscapes. I am of the belief that, with some exceptions which I will acknowledge, on the most part, we have been cautious enough that the risks in the balance have worked out well. But I don't think anybody elected me to judge, or you. We work for organizations, and they pay us to make the decisions we make, and that's fine. That's their right, and in a pluralistic society, I wouldn't have it any other way. But on these judgment calls about the preservation of lands in a particular place under particular circumstances, and judged in the context of other possible future outcomes, I trust long-established local people who know the land in question best, who are in conversation with their neighbors whose other interests in those lands are at stake as well in those decisions. And I have an enormous deference, as a matter of my personal philosophy, not to assume that my judgment is superior. Yes, I'm a national leader, somewhat self-appointed, I suppose, as we all are, of the wilderness movement. But I don't think the fact that I went through some mysterious anointment to be whatever it is I think I am as a leader of this group means that I have the last word on those matters. And I respect the fact that other people will disagree, and that these things are slippery slopes, not ledges. And in some cases, we will look back. I'm absolutely confident, and certainly other people will look back at decisions that I've been involved in and say, boy, he got that wrong. Or that one. Read the Alaska Lands, I know you have, George. Read the Alaska National Interest Conservation Lands Act wilderness provisions. There are a lot of accommodations to what are difficult, unique circumstances in Alaska. Were all of those perfect? I don't know. That law is going to be celebrating, we're going to be in Anchorage this year with President Carter celebrating the 25th anniversary of that law, and that's pretty young yet to reach those decisions. But I know that lines got around a lot of lands in Alaska, perfect or not, whether the lines are perfect and whether every legislative provision is perfect or not, and some of the accommodations may have gone too far. Could be. We had to agree to the package. And the fateful decision, and I was in the room, and there weren't very many people in the room, came down to one of those simple-minded decisions that doesn't take very long. It was the big, should we accept this law or not? Jimmy Carter was a lame duck. Ronald Reagan was going to be President of the United States in another 2 months. And the issue was, do you take the hard-fought law, or do you wait for a better day? And 25 years later, I have yet to see the better day. And so I'm at peace with the accommodations we made, even though some of them were extraordinarily painful. I'd have held out for no drilling, for wilderness immediately, for the Arctic coastal plain, just to pick one small example. And it's a rambling answer, but it's an unanswerable question, George, and I think you would agree that these, in the final analysis, are judgments, and equally honest, equally passionate idealists can differ about the judgment. I'm comfortable in my skin with the kind of decisions that have been made, for the most part, up to this period of time. And I'm very comfortable with leaving a great many of these decisions. Let me just give, for the general audience purposes, and we'll take one more question, just give an example. There's a lot of people who want to get very hard line about never releasing for potential other uses any acre presently designated a wilderness study area under the Federal Land Management Policy Act provisions concerning wilderness on lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. There's something between 14 and 16 million acres of such wilderness study area land subject to that protection right now. And the argument is, in the process of working out some legislative accommodation to actually designate some of those lands, and perhaps some other lands that weren't wilderness study areas, as wilderness, in the political circumstances in a particular state, is it ever a good idea or ever acceptable to release to other uses some of those wilderness study areas that have wilderness-like protection for the time being? You would have to have a great deal more faith that the Reagan administration and Secretary Watt made the right decisions every acre of the way in which areas got selected to be those wilderness study areas back in the early 80s, before I'd be willing to fall on my sword over every acre of them to this day, in contrast with all the other considerations that go into those judgments. And I don't know who to delegate that decision to, if not to the hardworking local environmental group leaders who paid their dues and know that land the best. And that's how I go to sleep at night with some of the decisions that are being made. And I know it's not a perfectly satisfactory answer. Is there some nice short, ma'am?
Very brief.
Yes.
How do you feel about acquiring land that has been scarred by logging and mining for future wilderness?
I don't think you have to do that. I don't think you have to do it for future wilderness. I think you can put it in the wilderness system today. And I think that because Congress has done it routinely. They did it in the Wilderness Act. The Shining Rock Wilderness was the last administratively protected wilderness area added by the Chief of the Forest Service in May of 1964. In knowing that in September of 1964 it would become one of the original units of the wilderness system. It was entirely logged in the teens and 20s. Burned over big slash fires, railroad log, there's all the railroad grades in it. Congress, the founders of the wilderness concept, Congress never intended the law to be that specific. The issue to Aldo Leopold about wilderness qualification was one kind of wilderness was primeval, never touched, the unbroken great chain of being from the mind of the Creator to the present day. That was one subcategory of the broader concept of wilderness that the founders of the Wilderness Society, Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, and others embraced. Far bigger deal to them was that there be no means of 20th century transportation, that the machine age, not meaning just motors, they carefully used the word machine and mechanization more commonly than they used motors. That's why mountain bikes are not allowed in wilderness areas. To keep the machinery of modern civilization and modern transportation out of wilderness areas was far more their priority. Should we preserve areas of pure wilderness wherever we can? You betcha. But if they include pockets, or if a wise boundary, or even the whole area, as in the Shining Rock, and Congress has done that again and again and again, and the people that have led the Congress in doing that in the early years were the authors of the Wilderness Act. John Saylor, Scoop Jackson, Frank Church felt adamantly about this because we had some serious dust-ups with particularly the U.S. Forest Service over exactly that question. And so Congress has done it. They do it fairly routinely. We apparently are going to have another round of that argument because it keeps coming back up. But we've now got 40 years of history of what the words in the Wilderness Act mean as interpreted by the Congress subsequently. So we know kind of, there's a lot of history, and most members of Congress have some respect for the precedent involved there. And I go back to those words I quoted from Senator Anderson. There's two definitions in the Wilderness Act. One is pure, and one is less severe or pure, and those are his words, not mine. And he was the father of the Wilderness Act. Thank you so much for your attention. I will stay till the last dog is slain and sign books in the back. Thank you so much.